Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 of finishing. This is tips and tricks. And real quick right here, I want to show you, I'm just blasting a little bit of finish and I can see the direction that overspray is traveling. In my case, from left to right or moving west. It also shows me a good indication of the fan width. All right, let's get going. So this video, tips and tricks, is going to have a little bit of overlap from the techniques video. My goal with these videos is to show or share those of you that are new to spraying a few pointers that'll help propel you a bit more quickly through the learning curve, yeah? Notice here as I'm spraying, I attempt to follow the natural shape of these components. Now this is a finish coat and you'll see that I'm spraying the edges first and then I follow that contour, right? Also, I feel it's very important, especially if you're just learning to spray, attempt to use your left and right hand regardless of which handed you were born with. This will come in super handy when you're spraying. As a matter of fact, I recommend it for all types of working in the shop, whether you're using a hammer or a file or a sander, hand plane, whatever, right? After doing that for a while, you will be amazed as to the efficiency of that endeavor. All right, let's spray the front side, and I noticed the breeze had picked up a little bit, so I'm going to separate these just to minimize or eliminate overspray. Again, noting the direction of the breeze and also the fan width. And here, yeah, I'm using my shirt, but I'm not getting any material on it. I'm merely back flushing. That tip has been sitting for a few minutes. I may have mentioned it's an airbrush technique, but it's an excellent spray tip. Pun intended. And hey, by the way, I've been spraying for a long time, but that doesn't mean I know everything. I absolutely love sharing and showing what works for me, but if you see something that I'm doing and you don't think it's right, let me know in the comments. I absolutely love learning just like the next person, and I believe we're in this information overload currently, and I love that. We can all learn from each other, yeah? So what I have here are some inserts that go around a sewing machine that go into a desk that I made years ago. And this is the original one that I made that surrounded this Bernina sewing machine. This is another insert that I made for a new machine that the lady ended up getting, years later, and fits the same size here, different machine. Well, recently she got yet another new machine, sewing machine, and so I had to make another insert. Now, this is the original one and the original color, and this is actually pretty close. It looks worse on camera, but it's actually pretty close. But what happens is it's tricky to match an old stain color because what happens is it ambers, it yellows, it's kind of has an orange tint to it. This is the same color, of course, on the back side, hasn't seen as much light, and this stain has stayed, or the stain is the same, but the finish changes. And this is probably pretty close to the color that it originally was. Well, I need to match this ambered or orange tone. And what happens is ultraviolet light changes, this was probably lacquer, and it creates that orangey effect. It's a dramatic difference from this side. It doesn't really matter. This is what I need to match. So trying to find a stain to match that can be challenging. And I'll show you how I get a closer match from this to this. I've mixed a little bit of red oxide and some of this yellow, and it's actually quite thin. And so this is mixed with a little bit of lacquer thinner and a little bit of the lacquer that I'll be using. And I can tone that stained panel or that insert to match. And of course, I'll do a practice shot, and then I'll also start on the back to make sure that I'm getting the color that I'm after. All right, so I've got some of that material in my gun. And what I've done is I've turned up my air pressure so that the material atomizes really well. I certainly don't want a speckled finish. And I've turned down my volume, so the amount of this toner that's coming through is turned down. So it's just putting down a little at a time, and I can really control the layering effect. I've put some on this already. You can see, I don't know how good it shows up on camera, but it is really close to the shade tone that I'm after. I could have used even less liquid material coming out, so what I want is a high pressure, highly atomized material, so I just lay down a mist. This is also thinned quite a bit of lacquer thinner, so it flashes off really quickly and it should blend well with the multiple layers that I end up putting. I might get away with just one or two, maybe three. It just depends. But a little at a time, I can sneak up on that color match. What's tricky is that you have to be careful and not overdo that tone that you're getting, because in reality, over the years, this is going to get its own patina and start to amber, so we don't want to overdo it, right? So I'm not going to go quite the full amount. I'm just trying to get close. All right, I'm getting there. So another thing to consider is the light environment. Here in my shop, I have LED lights, and so it can have a different cast. If you have it outside, that sunlight is good, but actually what you want is natural light. Just as a matter of fact, let's take this in here. So in this room, I have a couple of skylights. That is a pretty good match. It actually looks better than it does on camera. So yeah, a lot of factors going on here, but I think I got it. Now that I'm happy with the tone or color, I can add some finish, which will essentially be the seal coat. And these filters, they come flattened and they're really hard to use, so I like to fold them with 8 creases so they'll sit in the cup better. There we go. Ah. Something like that, right? And I like using these little Dixie cups. I think they're maybe a 4 or 5 ounce. I'm not really sure. But with that, I can get my ratios right. So for this particular finish, I'm going to do a 3 to 1.
2, 3.
And then I'll thin 1, and that'll be 25%. So 3 to 1. So it's easy to count these Dixie cups. You always need to thin. I'm using this medium rubbed sheen. This is a T77 pre-cat lacquer. And you'll notice when you're spraying, and it doesn't matter if it's latex paint or conversion varnish, anything. As you're spraying it, if it's kind of stippled looking or kind of a dry orange peel, it needs more thinner that's compatible with whatever you're spraying. If it's latex, then you need a little bit more water, whatever. But you want to lay down what's called a wet coat. And so the thinner is really important. But the trick is to not use too much thinner. And 10 to 20% is probably a good starting point. You can determine how it's laying down, once you start. You always want to maybe hit it, spray your gun on some cardboard or something to get a practice shot, see how it's laying down, and then you can adjust. And remember, I had maybe a teaspoon or 2 of lacquer thinner in the bottom, and that was all wet around to just wet the inside of the gun. And then when I add the lacquer thinner, the 25% that I'm adding, I put it in last for a couple of reasons. The first reason is to thin it, and another reason is I want to put it in last because I can swirl it around here like this, and that kind of washes out that mesh, because there's a good chance I'm going to be using this filter again, and they can plug up and dry really quickly. So by adding your thinner last, it basically rinses that lacquer out of the mesh. Makes sense, yeah? And this is where I park the filter and the little Dixie cup. Just a simple piece of 1/4 inch with a hole drilled in it. That way I can reuse it. All right, this is fantastic. Although this is not a high-end piece, the finish came out great. As mentioned before, I'll lay down 2 seal coats, followed by some light sanding, and then a top coat to finish. Here especially, I need to make sure that this is really sealed, otherwise I will sand off some of that toner that I applied. All right, this doesn't have anything to do with finishing, but I wanted to show you this component prior to it being stained and finished. That little Bernina in place, and check out that fit. Practically airtight. Little finger hole for the switch. This was a bit of a challenge since I had to do most of the fine tuning on site couldn't really bring that desk with me. But yeah, she was super happy. So I'm finishing these panels. Well, this entire project is getting finished with conversion varnish. I'm spraying it. I've laid down a couple of seal coats, and this feels rough. The raw wood, of course, was sanded smooth, and the seal coats, well, they seal the wood, and then the top coat, the last coat that I will do, will make everything nice and smooth. Now, of course, you sand between coats, and I like using 220 grit sandpaper. And here's a little trick for you. I like gluing my sandpaper back to back. It seems to me like this could be sold this way already, but I just use a spray 77 adhesive, contact cement, glue those back to back, because otherwise what happens, this is kind of rough. Of course, this is sandpaper, so it's, relatively rough, and it just sticks, right? So glued back to back, boom, much better, right? In addition, when you're using sandpaper to sand a finish like this, you don't want to just use your hand, or those pressure points of your fingers can telegraph, and you can literally see lines where those pressure points are. So I like using Scotch-Brite on top, and that just distributes the pressure much better. Of course, on something like this, I would probably use an orbital, but you certainly don't want to use an orbital on the edges because you'll burn through the corners. And of course, we're just sanding the finish. We're not sanding the wood, right? Yeah, that feels nice. And these corners, even though those were sanded smooth when this was raw, they still get a little bit rough after you put the seal coats. And so you don't want to use sandpaper on that because you'll burn right through that finish. But this Maroon 5 Scotch-Brite gets that, ooh yeah, that feels nice. So, yeah. That's how you do it, man. Hope that helps somebody out there, yeah? All right, 9 by 11, I believe. Yeah. Sanding paper, sanding sheets. This is from Maverick Abrasives. This is a 220 grit, and I like gluing 2 of them back to back, right? Contact cement. Just makes it really easy to use as you're sanding. It doesn't try to slip. And everyone's seen the cutting board for sandpaper, right? Simple hacksaw blade. Something like that. And for what I'm doing, I like them about this size. It makes a 3-inch by 2 3/4. And I get 12, 14 pieces out. 12 pieces. But yeah, that's how I do it. Incidentally, when you're using sandpaper to sand a finish or between finishes, you want to use a sterrated type. Even though lacquer thinner and water are not compatible, denatured alcohol mixes with both. So I'm getting ready to match some stain. My species is cherry. I need to get this dark. So I've got some solvent-based stain and some trans tint dye. And I like mixing it in something like this rather than a cup. With a cup, you're going to stir it. That works, but I want to put a lid on this and shake it. And as I'm using it, I can keep it shook and make sure that all those different colors stay mixed. Now, I just rinsed this Gatorade bottle with water, so it has moisture in it, it has water in it. And sure, you could let it sit, blow it with an air hose, whatever, but to make sure, or I'm kind of in a hurry, I need to have this done now. So what I like doing is adding some denatured alcohol. That mixes with the water. I can put an ounce or 2 in that, swish it around, shake it up really good, get it out, blow that with an air hose, and any alcohol that's left will mix with this solvent-based stain. So there you have it. In other words, the alcohol evaporates much quicker than water. So what I have here is some solvent-based stain, and rather than mixing this, what I need is some really dark stain, so it's all the solids or pigments have settled, and so I will utilize that in my favor by scraping the bottom and getting some of that off. I've already done this a couple of times, but my goal is to make a really dark stain. So I'm utilizing that pigment that settles at the bottom. There's not much left, as you can see, but it was pretty thick when I first started. So if you just stir this, then that's the color you're going to use. But if you need something darker, then you can steal that pigment off the bottom to make a darker stain. In addition, I'm using some of these trans tint dyes to get it darker, pouring it in this, mixing it up with some of the solvent, and then putting it in a bottle where you can shake it and really get those ingredients mixed in. Yeah. So I just finished spraying these. I set up in my garage. I have some panels and I make a spray booth with a fan and everything. Well, I shouldn't have taken it down so soon, because as I was fondling these and admiring the job that I did, I realized I got a lot of overspray on this particular panel. You can hear this. It's rough. Ugh. There's a little bit of a dust nib right there. Something right there. Right in here. You know, when you're spraying this type of a carcass, it's kind of tricky because your fan needs to be pulling the air and the overspray away from this. And a lot of times if I'm spraying in this direction and I'm not paying attention, I can get too much overspray or turbulence on the sides or off this side, and that overspray will stick. And this is nice and smooth, but I think that's what happened here. So let's see if we can address that. So I've got a razor blade, and these come typically in packs of 100, and they will almost always have like an oily film on them. So you want to clean that oil off. I'm using lacquer. If you're using conversion varnish, you want to make sure that this doesn't have oil on it. Now, if you're using an oil finish, like a wipe-on poly or whatever, this application or this situation won't really apply. This is for a top coat type finish like lacquer or conversion varnish. And I've never done this with conversion varnish, but with lacquer, pre-cat lacquer, this works excellent. So I'm going to take this razor blade and I'm going to slightly bend it with my 2 fingers and my thumb. Find that dust nib right there. Just go across that like that. You can see that dust that it produces. It's a real fine scrape. You see that lacquer dust? And it dulls the finish. But we're not going to respray it. I'm going to show you what we're going to do here in a bit. There's another one. And that's like a real subtle, gentle way to remove those without doing any damage. This probably doesn't show up on camera, but it leaves these little like scuff marks right where I dragged that razor blade. But that looks pretty good. Then we can take some of this Maroon 5 Scotch-Brite, and we're just gonna go over this entire thing. Again, this is dulling this finish. This sheen is a dull rub finish, so it's a little bit less than a semi-gloss. It's actually more like a satin. Not too shiny, but I like the look of it because it looks like a hand-rubbed finish, but offers the protection of a top coat type finish. So we're just going to go over all these surfaces that felt a little rough. You can hear this right here. It just feels like sandpaper. Smooth sandpaper, but still sandpaper. That feels better, but the sheen is gone, right? And with Scotch-Brite, you can see I'm going across the grain. I'm just not going, heavy, not heavy-handed, so it doesn't leave cross-grain scratches. I'm just trying to blend where those razor blades scuff the finish, and then we'll go on to the next step. I like this type of a blower instead of this one. This one works great for typical, working in the shop. But I have more control with this guy, and I just put a little rubber tip on the end. Now we're going to take some lacquer thinner, and I'm going to open this door. And I'm going to soak this rag that I have very carefully. This stuff is kind of dangerous. You don't want to splash this in your eyes. And it's pretty wet, just about dripping wet. See, I can almost squeeze that out. Pretty wet. You don't want it too wet, but it can't be dry. If I was to describe it, I'd say a little bit more than damp. And then carefully and quickly, we're going to go over this entire panel. And actually a better option is to just lightly scuff and respray. A lot of times you can respray with mostly thinner, maybe 10% lacquer, but that seems to work best for higher sheens for some reason. And here I was just being lazy because my gun was already cleaned. You just want to do it once over. You can't really go back over it. The lacquer thinner is softening that lacquer, and the rag will start to grab. Yeah, those fumes are strong. I got a good airflow going through here, so it flashes over really quickly. Ah, that feels so much better. It's nice and smooth. The sheen is back. It's consistent. I can look at that with this low raking light. A little bit of a rag mark there, but that blends pretty well. Then I blended this further with a shop paper towel. All right, check this out. So this handle is a separate piece from the rest of this drawer front. And I use a 23 gauge to hold that in place while the glue sets up. And I don't know if this shows up on camera, but there's some little nail holes. Matter of fact, let me pull this out of here. See those little, they're 23 gauge, they're pretty small, but I want to get rid of those. Put that guy back. Here's an easy way to do it. So first I'm going to sand that with some 220. And then I'm going to add a little bit of this wood putty, color putty. It's kind of a like clay wax. I'll just put that in there. Those little nail holes literally disappear. And then I go back over that with some of this maroon Scotch-Brite. This will get a top coat with lacquer, and those holes are virtually invisible. Not bad, right? And I'm using that 23 gauge pin nailer just to tack these handles in place. Of course, they get glued and clamped, but the pins just keep those handles from sliding around as I'm trying to clamp them. And here's a shot of the overall piece that actually included a king-size bed and some matching nightstands. And check out this integral backsplash. Man, I love this stuff. I didn't quite have enough room to do the headboard and the footboard and all the bed components, so I did them outside. The weather was a little bit cool, but it worked perfectly. And here I had a little bit of a gap. I'm going to show you how you can fix this. There's always solutions, right? So right here where I have this rail connecting to the stile, a tiny little gap. Let me show you more. I don't know how well it's going to show up, but I'm going to attempt to do this anyway. What I've got here is this color putty, and typically used for nail holes, right? Well, I have a little bit of a gap right here, and this is all mortise and tenon, so I know it's plenty strong. I'm not sure what happened. So I'll take a little bit of this putty and I'll just place it there and try to force some of this into that gap. Doesn't take much. Let's see. Your local paint store should have these plastic spatulas. I have one, couldn't really locate it, so I just used a sharpened shim, right? Tapered wedge, just like that. That looks a lot better. Okay, so these two things are the toe kick pedestals that the main pedestals of the bed will sit on, right? So this is the top of one, and you can see how it's flush. This is the bottom, and I don't know if that shows up. There's this real heavy chamfer. Let me turn this way. So you can see that heavy chamfer there. And I do that so that if this thing got scooted across the floor, it wouldn't chip this wenge. And then after it gets lacquered, I'll just hit it with this marker like that. And you won't see that white bevel or chamfer when I get done hitting it with that marker. All right, so here's a clip of the finished bed, and some of you may have seen this already. For those of you that have not, here's a cool little feature. So here in the center, this removable stile is actually magnetic, right? We can remove that. It's actually a key. Place it in a sweet spot right there. Push the door in, and boom, the door will pop open, allowing for a hidden stash underneath the mattress. My awesome customer was thrilled. Oh, and you can see below the wenge toe kick, that chamfer literally disappears. What you're looking at here is the front right corner of a drawer box, and see that tiny little gap right there on the rabbet. So I'm getting ready to shoot the top coat. And so a little trick you can do is, this has already been sanded with 220, but I blew it off and all that dust came out and that little gap showed up. So I can sand this again and just wipe this and leave that dust in that little gap. I'll lacquer that and that'll disappear. This may sound weird, but it was probably too small of a gap for even putty. So yeah, small details, but yeah, it all adds up. Here's some information on my air compressor, and this thing easily handles consistent air usage while I'm spraying. And since I live in high desert area, high humidity is really not an issue. So I just use a couple of air filters, this one here at the tank, and I'll show you another one in the next clip. So these are the guns I use. This one's actually really inexpensive. It's a Fine X by Graco, and inexpensive gun, but works really well for most of the projects that I shoot. I like it because it's small and nimble, right? This one is my DeVilbiss FLG4. This thing is awesome. This thing shoots a huge wide pattern and really lays down the finish. This one was a bit more, maybe $500 or $600, 400. I don't really remember anymore, but I like this for large surfaces. Like I mentioned, it lays down a large quantity of finish quickly. You can see this one has a regulator on it. This one I don't have a regulator on it. I just utilize this air volume knob here. But if I'm spraying something important, I almost always use, in addition to the water filter I showed you, I like one of these inline filters right here at the end of the hose. You know what I mean? Instead of the beginning of the hose, which it can condensate in the hose from the tank to your gun. So I put these at the end of the hose. A little bit cumbersome, but with the way I angle these at a 45-degree angle, works really well. You want to practice as much as you can. If you're new to this, get the feel for the gun. I just have water in here. I'm going to be spraying cardboard. You want to get familiar with the adjustments. This knob at the top is almost always going to be your fan width, right? So when it's turned all the way down, tightened, it's going to produce a narrow fan pattern. We can open that up. It'll make the pattern or the fan width wider. I don't know how well that shows up, but wider pattern. Practice on cardboard. It's really an awesome way to learn. This knob here on most guns is going to be your volume how much material is coming out. We can turn that way down. Right now it's turned all the way in and nothing will come out. As I open that, just a mist. I almost always have this practically all the way out where it's just pure volume. There are some situations, as you see in the video, where I will turn that down, but this is almost always open full blast. Not always, but I'd say 90% of the time. I showed you on my other gun where this had a regulator. On this one, it just has a knob here, and with that, I can control air pressure. I've mentioned before, everything when spraying is a compromise. If we have a narrow pattern, a very narrow pattern, we'd want to turn the volume down because that fan is concentrating the material and you can easily get a run. When we open up the fan pattern, we also want to open up the volume. We need more material because it's applying to a larger surface. In addition, a narrow fan will probably, most likely, require less air. A wider fan, with this opened up, will require more air. That's extreme, but you can see how wide that pattern goes. Here I have the air pressure turned down. The pattern is moderately wide, but I don't have enough air pressure, and you can hear how it kind of stipples. It almost spits. If I turn up the air pressure, it's going to atomize better. However, it produces a lot of overspray. You need to compromise with those two settings. When using a gun like this, there's a part that is called a half trigger. So I can pull this halfway. You can see how it's just blasting air, no finish. So halfway. That'll give you beautiful control. So in other words, when we're spraying this pattern, I'm going to leave the air flowing continuously, but I only depress the trigger fully when I want to lay the material down. If I start out here with the trigger pressed fully, I'm just wasting material and creating more overspray. So ultimately, what I want to do is depress fully right as I reach the edge of my panel or door or whatever the component is. Now the instructions are going to tell you to move completely even like that. And yeah, in a perfect world that makes sense. But my arm is connected to my shoulder and that creates a radius. I utilize that in my favor. It just makes it easier. And a little bit of arc or angle is not going to do anything. As a matter of fact, in the prior video, I talked about angling as I spray a door to get inside the stiles and rails on that little edge inside the panel. As you get more comfortable with spraying, you'll notice that you can whip your wrist at the end of each stroke, and that gets you back on target quickly. Let me demonstrate. Or you can release the trigger. For this first half, I kept the trigger depressed and just whipped my wrist at the end of each stroke. This time, I'm going to utilize the half trigger. Both techniques work. All right, here's some finished shots. Conversion varnish, bedroom set, right? This little sideboard was also shot with conversion varnish. Conversion varnish is going to be a little bit more durable than lacquer, but lacquer is more forgiving and easier to apply, which is what I used here. It's an older piece, and check out that marquetry, how it blends with the handles. That project was so fun. This was a large barn door, about 50 inches by 90 tall, pre-cat lacquer over dyed veneer. Here's another project with conversion varnish, bookcase, and desk for some wonderful clients. And I'll admit I went a little nuts with the texturing. Anyway, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Get out there and practice spraying and make your day amazing.